I wrote an article, a short chronicle, in which I described a scene from my daughter's childhood where she was playing at catching seeds that floated through the air. There was a sunset in the background, and she was jumping, trying to catch those seeds drifting in the air. That scene had a profound impact on me because it was so perfectly beautiful that it made me wonder, why isn't beauty eternal? Where does it go when it hides from us? Where does a scene like that go? It feels as if it were something divine, because there was nothing superfluous there. The purity of the child, the beauty of the sunset in the background, it was all so perfect. And when that moment passes, you're left wondering, how can it be? How does it pass? Where do things go when they pass? And why does life play at giving us things only to take them away again? What a cruel thing this is. What is the meaning behind all of this? Why does life play at creating bonds, and then make us break them? What is it trying to teach us through this? Transience. I doubt there is anyone who has not suffered because of it. I doubt it. Because it is a process that, even when nothing exceptional has happened, with you, just through the natural course of life, you will experience many losses. And some of them will be quite painful. And we are left in that state of perplexity, not knowing why things are transient. Certainly, if we take these ancient traditions into account, life is trying to tell us something through this. Life does not simply want to hurt us, to play hide and seek with us, to make us think we possess things, and then, suddenly, we no longer have them. So, this is a question that Campbell answers in a very interesting way. He suggests engaging in a dialogue with life and seeking to understand what it is trying to communicate. Through this process, in such a way that, gradually, your consciousness moves from the transient to the permanent. Find something that is always present in every stage of life. And understand that what is real cannot be lost. I have often shared with you this phrase, which comes from St. Augustine, who says that what is truly yours cannot be taken from you. In other words, to discover what is truly mine. Where is this point, this center of stability, that allows me to remain serene in the face of life's apparent losses, realizing that, in truth, what we truly possess cannot be taken from us by anything or anyone. And what has been lost was merely an illusion. So, to engage in dialogue means to stop fighting with life and to cease having destructive suffering, and instead to experience constructive suffering, which resolves itself in a state of serenity and maturity. Maturity, let me repeat this word, is one of the rarest qualities in our current historical moment. You may not agree with me, but I invite you to reflect on this for a moment. We suffer from a collective psychological immaturity in today's world, or do you think otherwise? Rationally, perhaps we are advanced, but psychologically, do you believe that people in general are truly mature? In general, no. We are often very fragile, very insecure, lacking a clear sense of purpose in life. And this collective immaturity leads us to constantly struggle against life itself. So, instead of learning from suffering, suffering becomes morbid and destructive. When we suffer, but that suffering is understood and assimilated, we are able to extract its lessons. When you look back, and this is a good way to assess how we are experiencing our suffering, look back at the hardships you have faced and see whether they helped you grow or not. And when suffering helps you grow, you generally say, it wasn't too high a price compared to what it gave me, it was well worth it. It was a fair price. Do you understand? If it weren't for that, I wouldn't be here. Well, then it was worthwhile. But if you look back and say, I can't even bear to remember that, it was a trauma, then it hasn't been resolved. And when something hasn't been resolved, when it only brought pain but didn't bring awareness, do you know what usually happens? You will have to go through it again. It's like a school grade where you failed, as people commonly say. What happens then? You repeat the grade, you'll have to go through it again. Because there is a lesson there that you haven't learned. Therefore, something symbolically equivalent will have to repeat itself in your life. So, there is this difference between constructive suffering, which helps us grow, and destructive suffering, which only creates knots, only generates traumas, and which, consequently, will eventually need to be untied, understood, and assimilated. So, let's continue. Campbell's biography is also not the main focus of this reading circle, but these are some details to help us situate ourselves. So, he was an American who lived in the last century, between 1904 and 1987, from an upper-middle-class background, and who one day fell in love with the culture of the Native Americans. He recounts this himself, because if there is someone who was extensively interviewed and written about, it is him. He has an authorized biography, and there is already a wealth of information about Campbell's life, including information provided by himself. He says that when he visited the American Museum of Natural History in New York, he realized that this was his calling, to dedicate himself to researching the most diverse cultures, folklore, myths, and to understanding the symbolism of different peoples. And it's interesting that he awakened to this vocation and remained deeply loyal to it throughout his entire life. His entire life, he devoted himself to this pursuit. He set out in search of myths from the four corners of the world, and he sought them not simply to collect information, but to extract from them an explanatory synthesis that could be applied to everyone. This is what he calls the monomyth. It is truly fascinating to understand his reasoning in this regard. Well, he graduated from Columbia University, specializing in English and medieval literature. Afterwards, he spent 2 years in Europe. There, he was influenced by a host of emerging thinkers and writers, such as James Joyce, whom he often references. And so, when he returned from Europe, he had studied Sanskrit, learned many languages, and come into contact with various cultures. He no longer wished to focus on medieval literature. Now he wanted to pursue Oriental literature. And this was not well received by those who supervised, the advisors who oversaw his postgraduate studies. He ended up leaving academic life behind. Now, it's interesting because this marks a particular phase. Imagine the discipline he maintained for several years, right after he left the university. He divided his day into 4 blocks of 4 hours each. For 3 of those blocks, he would read, and for 1, he would rest. Do you realize what that means? That's 12 hours of reading every day. He spent 5 years living this way, following a study program of his own design, focused on the subjects he was passionate about. He became an autodidact and was truly brilliant. Campbell spoke many languages. And when he was in Europe, he learned to speak both German and French fluently, and he never stopped speaking them for the rest of his life. He lived in Europe for only 2 years. He spoke several languages, studied Sanskrit, and traveled all over the world. In other words, he was someone for whom study and reflection were lifelong habits. So, he was influenced by a wide range of authors. One influence you will notice, which is very strong, comes from psychoanalysis. Jung's clinical psychology and Freudian psychoanalysis, he often references and cites these schools of thought. In fact, I sometimes build bridges so that we can move from the psychoanalytic ground he discusses to the philosophical ground, which is our focus. And it is important to understand that there are equivalents in both worlds. An interesting fact is that he also met Jiddu Krishnamurti during one of his travels, where he didn't even know who he was and ended up making contact. Jiddu Krishnamurti, who at the time was, so to speak, a master connected to theosophy, connected to the Iona, and they developed a friendship. In short, he was also influenced by writers, literary figures, and researchers such as Wilhelm Steckel, who was one of the dissidents of the Freudian school. He draws inspiration. He goes about gathering thoughts that could serve as a foundation for what he intended to defend, for what he intended to reveal. He believed that there was a common meaning in all the mythologies of humanity, both past and present. In fact, he thought that even dreams, some dreams, because there is a significant difference within the universe of dreams, some dreams followed the same mythical structure. This is very similar to Jung's thinking in this regard. Quite similar, indeed. Well, he had a childless marriage and devoted himself, and here is something very interesting, because this. Where is he? Heinrich Zimmer. He wrote one of the most beautiful books I have ever read. It's about the history of India, a book truly worth reading one day, called The Philosophies of India. Zimmer, who was a profound connoisseur of India, died without actually writing anything substantial, leaving behind a sort of Manuel Bandera of scattered papers everywhere. He wrote a great deal, but never condensed his thoughts into a single book. The person who took on the task of condensing, editing, and publishing Zimmer's works was Campbell, who was very fond of him. They were friends. He took on this responsibility, and it was a significant contribution, because to edit Zimmer, you had to possess deep knowledge. Zimmer's thought, the coherence of his ideas, through this process, Campbell also learned a great deal. Well, in the end, he fulfilled a lifelong dream of his, which was to travel and spend some time abroad. He spent a year between India and Japan. Undoubtedly, this must have been a truly enriching journey, because when he returned, he was full of ideas. A man who loves myths, traveling to India and Japan, it's like a child going to Disney World. He must have come back from there truly inspired, and indeed, he did return inspired. Well, I won't go into too much detail. Details about his body of work. Campbell's work is extensive. He not only produced written works, but there is also a wealth of videos and recorded interviews. A vast number of biographies written about him, both authorized and unauthorized. There is a universe of information. Since he is a relatively recent writer, he has had a profound impact on Western thought. He even inspired George Lucas in the creation of Star Wars. Lucas drew all his inspiration from Campbell's work. In short, he was a thinker of great influence, so there is a wealth of bibliography both by him and about him. A great deal of literature has been written by him and about him. In terms of the most well-known literature in Brazil, we have The Hero's Journey. The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which we'll be discussing. The Masks of God consists of 4 substantial volumes, exploring mythology divided by sectors, by areas of humanity. It seems to be a very interesting book. I haven't read it in its entirety, only excerpts, but it's somewhat unfeasible for a commented reading, considering its length. 4 volumes. God and the Mysteries of the Feminine Universe, this one. I still intend to talk about it someday, because it is quite interesting. Well, just so you have an idea, his body of work is more or less homogeneous in terms of interests. He is interested in understanding these archetypes of humanity, the origins of myths, and in creating certain models that can be applied everywhere, across time and space. Well, the fundamental idea of the book we are discussing, this dear little greenish-blue book of ours, is the concept of the monomyth. That is what he sets out to demonstrate. There is a common journey throughout history. Among heroes, whether those we call mythical, who existed only in the human imagination, or historical heroes. There is a shared path, and he calls this the monomyth. A single hero behind all myths, religions, fairy tales, and universal folklore. He was ambitious. Truly ambitious and broad in his generalizations. He argues that there is a journey, the journey of the monomyth, that every hero undertakes, which some stories omit certain parts of this journey, and even the act of omitting them is meaningful. And this says something about that tradition. But, in general, even if hidden, all the stages are present. And what is the fact represented by all these heroic journeys? It is simply the encounter and sharing of the human path with one's own identity. He says, look, everyone is here. Adrift, in chaos, disorder, lacking a clear sense of purpose. Until everyone experiences the phenomenal moment of realization. He'll stop using this example, because payphones don't exist anymore. Kids these days don't even know what that moment of realization refers to. It's become a very outdated example. Can you help me come up with a more high-tech one? Because this one is a bit obsolete. In the past, there were phones where you'd have that moment of realization, for those who don't know. Anyway, there's a fundamental realization here, which is, I came here to be a human being. And I haven't done anything about that yet. Let me start doing that now. Let me discover what nature expects from me, how I can fulfill myself, how I'm happy. When this realization dawns, a person begins the adventure of seeking their own identity, which is generally a quest for inner unity, internal cohesion, and external unity, the highest degree of fraternity. He discovers a certain key that leads to this human condition. And when he finds this key, he returns to the world he came from to share it. So, this journey is always present, leaving behind the ordinary, seeking the sacred, finding an identity, a sense of purpose, and then returning to share it. He will say that this is what it's all about. The search for and recovery of the human sense of life, the search for and recovery of unity. Everyone does this, and I saw very similar stages. Well, as I mentioned to you, he doesn't always use it in all his books, The Masks of God. From what I could see, he draws much more from history, anthropology, and even philosophy. In this particular work, he relies heavily on psychoanalysis, on Jung's analytical psychology. He bases himself more on this field of studies of the psyche. And he will say that There is a mythical structure that emerges from the collective unconscious, a Jungian concept, and that this generates in human beings a perception as if, at a certain moment, an alarm clock rings within each person. The time to grow. Contents surface that demand from the individual, causing discomfort, unease, a restlessness, which urge them to seek a more concrete, more human, more meaningful purpose in life. He calls this the emergence from the unconscious. Now, here, I would like to draw a parallel on one point. Because when we talk about the unconscious, the collective unconscious, and so on, these Jungian concepts, our tendency is to think that myth is something that arises from each person's personal unconscious. Jung, for example, did not intend to say this. He spoke of the collective unconscious of humanity as if there were certain contents that exist on some plane of humanity, waiting for each human being to recover them, to take possession of them. This is very similar to what Plato called the theory of ideas, the world of ideas and the concrete world. It is very similar to what, for those who have read the Kybalion calls the mind of God, where, at a certain moment, these ideas descend into the mind of man. I just wanted you to understand one thing. What is the unconscious for philosophy? You are doing something today, I don't know, driving your car. The mood you are in, the mental states you experience, the way you are at this moment is influenced by a multitude of things you are not aware of. Or maybe not. A lot of things. And this is your unconscious. Now, these things you are not seeing. They may be rooted in your past, absorbed during your childhood, which is what we call the personal unconscious. But it could also be in the convergence of Jupiter with Saturn, couldn't it? Couldn't they be influencing you? This is a cosmic unconscious. It could be, I don't know, in the heat, this would be a climatic unconscious. Everything that influences you and that you are not clearly aware of, that is your unconscious. So, to say that myths come from the unconscious does not mean that they come only from something inside the human mind. They come from a plane that exists in nature and that humanity does not yet know. It is something that acts upon us, but that we do not yet understand. Plato said it was the world of ideas. I find this idea quite reasonable, that the entire world would first be born on the mental plane. The ideas of the universe were born before the physical universe. And as beings evolve, they increasingly resemble the idea to which they are meant to correspond. In other words, to evolve is to align yourself with the model that exists for you on the plane of ideas. The Kybalion and the Egyptians spoke of the same thing. It is the mind of God. When forms descend here below, they become imperfect because of the resistance of matter, and they continue to evolve in order to coincide with these ideas from the mind of God. In other words, models. Myths would be models of all manifested things, which would exist before the manifested things themselves were born. Before the human being was created, there would already exist a model for what purpose the human serves in nature. And humanity manifests and strives to live up to this model. This would be evolution. So, this idea of the archetype, using a more familiar term, the archetype would be a model. And each time you evolve, you become more similar to this model. Imagine the following. The universe, as conceived by many ancient philosophies, is seen as being filled with beings in a state of evolution. Today, we already know that this is the case. Plants evolve, animals evolve, and even stones undergo a process of becoming more complex. Their molecular organization becomes increasingly intricate. This is evolution. We know that evolution exists on all levels. This aligns closely with what was believed in ancient times. The universe is filled with beings in evolution, all moving toward eventually returning to unity. It is said that everything emerged from unity and will one day return to unity. This is a Pythagorean idea. Along this journey, there is a group of beings, us, humanity, who have emerged from absolute ignorance and will one day reach absolute wisdom as human beings. That is the highest achievement a human being can attain. Now, to move from ignorance to wisdom, there are many steps you must climb. There are difficulties you will have to face. There are inertias you will have to break, and obstacles you will have to overcome. Imagine that, in the realm of ideas, there exists the perfect formula for you to overcome all these stages. I always give an old example, but it left a deep impression on me. When I learned what a myth was, I never forgot it. It was my grandmother's sewing. I can't give a lecture without mentioning my grandmother. It would feel incomplete. My grandmother was an exceptional seamstress, and watching her work with her patterns always fascinated me. Because she made patterns for everything, using tissue paper, and I couldn't understand how those scribbles, which seemed to have nothing to do with clothing, would become garments. Then she would explain to me, when you add fabric, a zipper, buttons, that pattern becomes a pair of pants or a blouse. It doesn't look like it, because it's just a pattern, just paper. But when you add material, it transforms. And that idea, when I started learning about myths, made perfect sense to me. A myth is a model of a human being. When you add flesh, bone, energy, and everything else inside, it becomes a human being. So, the myth is a perfect model of how a human being can overcome all the challenges they must face until reaching the fullness of the human condition. And to evolve means to overcome these obstacles. And if you make use of the guidance that is outlined in the model, in the myth, you can overcome these difficulties much more easily. So, imagine this chart that I've shown here. It's as if, for each of these stages of evolution, there is a corresponding myth. And the myth of the hero is precisely about the individual who has gone through all these stages, overcoming the challenges of each one with the least effort and the greatest success. They have learned to ascend the staircase in the most perfect way, and they pass this knowledge on to the future of humanity. Well, of course, we face both the simplest and most common difficulties in life, as well as the most complex ones. It is said that all of them have their own myths. Campbell will mention something very interesting: the traditional rites of passage that we once had. In fact, within our own society, we still have some, although they have lost their effectiveness. But in simpler societies, you can sense that they are still quite effective. So here, I included, as he uses in his example, an indigenous tribe. When a boy transitions from childhood to adolescence, from adolescence to youth, to adulthood, the responsibilities he must assume within the tribe, all of this is marked by a very clear ceremony, a rite of passage. The boy already knows, as he sees that rite approaching, he already understands that from that point on, he will have to be different. He will have to let go of certain things and embrace new ones. And this is deeply respected by society. It is, so to speak, a moment of psychological transition. It is embedded within the culture, which helps individuals overcome certain stages and enter new ones. He speaks of the necessity of these rites, emphasizing how important they are because they create challenges. There is an attachment to a certain stage, meaning a death to childhood and a rebirth into adolescence. A death to adolescence and a rebirth into youth, into adulthood. This is one of the beautiful insights he shares. Human beings are so afraid of death because they do not die 1,000 times throughout their lives. If a person were to die 1,000 times during life, they would learn how to die and be reborn. They would not be so afraid because life is full of little deaths. But if you never die along the way, you will have to face only that final one, and then it becomes much harder. If you learn to die to certain experiences and be reborn on another level, death becomes Dhammapada. He will speak further about this, that the best antidote to death, the only thing that overcomes death, is rebirth. I find this beautiful. If you know how to be reborn, you have conquered death. If not, you have not. So, he talks about how these protocols, these social canons of each culture, used to help and still help. However, in our society, this has become very hollow. They have turned into mere formalities, which people sometimes even give up on. For example, a wedding ceremony, or some kind of baptism ceremony, these ceremonies today have become formalities that are very empty of meaning and do not produce a very significant psychological transition. And people end up being left behind. They do not move on to the next stage, and this is the collective immaturity that we are experiencing. He says that we live in, this expression I found interesting, an inverted emphasis syndrome. Instead of culture inviting you to move forward, to turn the page, it invites you to stay behind. He explains how, for example, there are failed marriages because the husband or wife never stopped being daddy's or mommy's little child. They did not stop being children in order to become husbands, or wives, or parents. They remained in the previous stage. They are not prepared for a new social role, to embody a new position that society expects from them. They are not ready for this. And this is valued in society. It has become fashionable. You may have already heard about the children, kangaroo children, right? Because the parents are 60 years old and they are 40, still living at home. The parents are 70 and they are 50, still living at home. And society thinks this is great. All right, there is nothing against the way of life each person chooses. But would you agree that this creates a bond of mutual dependence, which may not be very healthy? Because perhaps it would be natural for the child to learn to face life on their own. Perhaps it would also be natural for the parents that the child fulfill their destiny and the parents return to their own starting point. Perhaps it would be healthier for the growth of both sides if life simply followed its course. This pathos of inverted emphasis values those who did not move forward, those who stayed behind. In other words, they never stopped being the little child. And yet it was already time for them to be a grandparent. And he never stopped being the little child. And this, he says, this is complicated, and our culture encourages this emotional paralysis. It does not give specific value to rites of passage, so the individual does not mature. And it seems that life, and Campbell strongly believes this, and I find it very beautiful, Ife has a purpose for these transitions it presents to us. Each one of them has something to teach us. Imagine you are taking a train journey. You get off at the first station, experience the culture, try the local cuisine, observe the folklore, and then return to the train. You learn a lot in that city. You get off at the second station and learn many new things. If you stop at every station and learn everything there is to learn, by the end of the journey, you become wise. But when a person is very immature, they only get off at the first station, ignoring all the others. They simply do not want to. So, by the end of the journey, they are still a child, having only the experience of childhood. It seems that life created all these stations because each one has something you need to gather. So that, by the end of the journey, you can assemble your own puzzle, which is your very identity. And if you do not get off at some of these stations, it means something. Some piece of your puzzle will be missing in the end. Life is not chaos, it is cosmos. It is entirely pedagogical, and it has something to teach you with everything it offers for you to experience. So, becoming stuck in a certain age group, which our culture often does, if not in childhood, then in adolescence, and if not in adolescence, then in youth, means that from that point on, no one moves forward, because only youth is valued. People spend their whole lives trying to force youth to never end, or to return, isn't that so? Only youth is considered valuable. So, everything beyond that is seen as monotonous. This is when children are not also encouraged to reach youth faster than normal, because only youth is valued. So, we end up fighting against life, and as a consequence, we miss out on what it has to teach us. Many pieces are missing from our puzzle when it comes time for us to make sense of our lives. Many parts are missing. Well, the monomyth, then, will include these phases, which begin with separation. Separation means breaking away from banality. You are living completely alienated, on autopilot, merely surviving. Then, at some point, an impact comes, a trial. I separate myself from the world I used to live in. He says something beautiful about this, everyone, something called a crisis. Later on, he'll repeat this information, but let me anticipate it now, because I found this wonderful. He said that every time you enter a crisis, there is a tendency. We tend to blame ourselves and say, oh, I'm here because I made mistakes. Sometimes, that's true. But sometimes, you are in this crisis because of merit, not because of fault. You did everything you needed to do, you completed the previous stages, and now it's time to move forward. Life is urging you to advance. In other words, thanks to everything you have done, you have reached the moment to let go of it all and start again on a new level. It's like the young person, which is very common nowadays. The one who finishes middle school, enters high school, and then faces a crisis, because high school is that whirlwind of preparation for college entrance exams. But why did they reach high school? Is it because they are being punished? No, it's because they did everything right. Everything in middle school. They passed. So, a crisis is not always because you are being punished. Sometimes, a crisis happens because the alarm clock of life has rung, signaling that it's time for you to close one chapter and move on to the next. Sometimes, a crisis is actually a very positive sign, moments for growth. So, he will say that a monomyth goes through these phases: separation, initiation, return, and sharing. Think about the stories, all the heroes, both historical and symbolic, that you know. In general, this is the path that unfolds. Separation from ordinary life, from the everyday routine, followed by trials, repeated trials. Until the hero understands, overcoming these trials. From the moment the hero understands what these trials mean and defeats the element he is struggling against, which is initiation, that is, a new level of consciousness, he returns and shares what he has learned. The relationship between myth and dream, he explains that, at first, they share a common element, which is a symbolic representation of what your psyche is asking of you. However, in the case of dreams, we often mix in many personal elements, making the message unrecognizable. In the case of myth, this is much clearer. But, in general, these are elements that reflect your psyche's call for growth. A call from your soul for you to turn the page. A thirst for growth. A need for expansion, present both in dreams and in myths. But myth is less distorted by personal elements. He states that every human culture that was truly a culture, that is, a community that cultivated the human being and fostered growth, was marked by the emergence of myths in society, myths that had not surfaced until then. In other words, when myths are born into the world, they shape human culture, the true culture, which is the one that encourages us to grow. When the cultural elements that surround us do not inspire us to grow, they do not truly deserve to be called culture, because they do not cultivate. Perhaps they are pulling us downward instead of upward. Then he gives some very interesting examples, such as King Minos. Crete. Minos, for those who know the story, received a white bull from Poseidon. This was a consecration, affirming that he was the legitimate king of Crete. I won't go into details, his struggle with his brothers and everything else. But this white bull was meant to be sacrificed in honor of the god Poseidon, so that Minos could become a true leader. In other words, the idea of, forgive me, to sacrifice, a complicated word. To sacrifice the white bull was to sacrifice his own personal self. It is said that every king, every leader, is someone who must sacrifice the personal, for the sake of the collective, for the sake of being a point of reference. And because he did not make this sacrifice, it means that he was arrogant, he was selfish. He wanted the merits for himself, he wanted to work for his own personality. And this causes him to become a tyrant, which leads to the entire drama of Minos' lineage. Because this bull, the queen falls in love with it and gives birth to a monster with it, which is Minos, and that whole story. The whole story that you all know. He says that every time a person has power and exercises that power selfishly, they become a tyrant. Even if you are not a king, in your personal life, when you have power and use it selfishly, you become a tyrant. At the very least, you tyrannize yourself and the people around you. And this tyrant, he calls forth the presence of a hero to come and rescue him. The hero is exactly the opposite of the tyrant. He is the one who has consciously chosen to subordinate himself to universal laws, to do what is just, noble, and good, so that the just, the noble, and the good may come into the world through him, so that his causes are no longer personal. Let them be universal, let them be human. He goes on to say that Arnold Toynbee, who was a historian, I didn't even know that Toynbee spoke about myths. It was someone from my own field who told me this. Toynbee said that the hero is nothing more than the tyrant transfigured, reborn. Sometimes they are not two different people, but one and the same. I had already seen this in the myth of King Arthur, that when the Uther Pendragon dies through the spell of transmutation, he becomes Arthur. It is the same being. Arthur, purified through the sword of will, Excalibur. I won't tell that story now, but this story of the spell of transmutation means a character who is reborn, purified. He says that when you are a tyrant, you are invoking a hero who sometimes arises from within yourself. I don't know if you understand what I mean. One thing is the king of Crete, another is you, who are the king of your own life. But if you are a bad king, a tyrant, you are calling forth the hero within you to overthrow yourself, to remove you from power and establish a new level of consciousness. One that does not rule life for personal gain, but is capable of consciously subordinating itself to universal laws. Every time a tyrant arises, so does the prophecy of the hero. He will come at any moment. This happens both individually and collectively. It is the victory over the personal and the conquest of the human, that is, the temporal man becomes an eternal, universal man. The tyrant becomes the hero. The temporal man becomes the eternal man, who no longer works solely for his own selfish survival, but strives to bring about real transformation in the world and within himself. Remember that phrase from Cicero that I've mentioned to you a million times. Make sure that you are a positive influence in the lives of those who participate. In other words, you leave here a little greater, and the people who lived alongside you are also a little greater. You made a difference. A real difference, because everything else is just a shadow. The real difference is, I grew, and I helped others to grow. In the face of death, that is all that will remain. Do you know what you will think about when you are confronted with death? In the face of death, we reflect, I used my life to grow as a human being and to allow those who lived with me to grow as well. And this is the only true wealth that no one can take away from you, and that you can carry with you in that moment. It is said, though I do not know if this story is true, that Alexander the Great, before he died, and it is quite possible this is folklore, but let us consider it, requested that his coffin be carried with his hands outside, because he was practically the king of the world, and he wanted everyone to see that he went to the grave with empty hands. That nothing he had conquered could be taken with him to the grave. Whether it is folklore or not, the story is interesting. And it is said that what leads a person out of this labyrinth of life, where one gets lost in irrelevant and personal matters, is Ariadne's thread. What is this Ariadne's thread that led one out of the labyrinth? It is a thread woven by all the heroes who have ever existed in history, those who ventured into labyrinths and found their way out. In other words, the path is left by all the heroes throughout history. That is to say, there has always been someone who has overcome selfishness. There has been someone who has overcome any kind of separateness. There has been someone who has truly been of service to humanity as a whole. If such a person existed, he is a thread. You can follow this path to find your way out of the labyrinth. For those who have read a wonderful book from the East, the Bhagavad Gita, when does the Bhagavad end? The Gita has a passage that I find very beautiful, which says that whenever you feel downcast, defeated, without strength in the face of the human drama, look to the horizon, and there you will see Arjuna, the prince among men, victorious over his enemies. I find this passage very interesting. There was a man who triumphed. He is there on the horizon. It was Arjuna. Oh, he succeeded, so it is possible for me too. One person succeeded, so I can too. This is the value of the hero for humanity. One person succeeded, so I can too. This is the thread of Ariadne, which guides me out of the labyrinth. Who managed to get out, and how did they do it? And who was it that escaped the labyrinth? It is good for us to look at history and notice who, in fact, managed to leave the labyrinth. Who were the people who were not crushed by attachment to fleeting things? Who were not overwhelmed by the anguish of being attached to things they are constantly losing every day? They lose their appearance in the mirror. They lose their status. They lose their recognition. Sometimes they lose superficial friendships. They lose so many things. How dreadful that is. It seems that, from the moment our hourglass was turned over, we have only been losing. The sand has only been falling. The sand does not rise, it only falls. The law of gravity for the sand in our lives is something dreadful. It never rises. The sand only falls. So, if we do not learn anything from life, it seems that life becomes a waiting game where we lose more and more each time. So, let us look at those who did not live this way, those who reached the end of their lives having truly gained much, both for themselves and for humanity. Some of these individuals, we are speaking about them here today, which means we have learned from them. In other words, they were victorious. This is the thread of the lives of heroes who found their way out of the labyrinth, a precious legacy for humanity. Plato already spoke about this, about the importance of the hero. Essential for society, the hero restores humanity's belief in itself. Look at how beautiful this phrase is, a phrase worthy of being placed on a cabinet door. I've told you before that I did this for a long time, and I recommend it. Use brightly colored poster board, the really bold, colorful kind, and markers. Write the phrases on the poster boards, and until you memorize them, you don't take them down. You end up living in that room, dreadful and full of poster boards. You force yourself to memorize them. You don't remove those things until you do. It was effective. I memorized a lot that way. Many poster boards have ended up on my cabinet. Look at how beautiful this is. Only birth can overcome death. Isn't that beautiful? It may seem paradoxical, but it makes perfect sense. For example, as I was telling you, crises. In a crisis, something dies, and something new is born in its place. That is a sign that I have truly lived through that crisis. But I keep refusing to let go of what wants to die. It feels as if it'll die along with it. Sometimes people are in crisis and feel as though they are dying, or sometimes they want to die, or sometimes they even take their own lives, which is truly heartbreaking. Isn't that so? In fact, there really is something dying. I want to die. Well, it depends on what you call yourself. A part of you, I believe, is indeed meant to die, and it is good that it does. But another part is there, being nurtured, wanting to be born. That is healthy. And this is what it means to live with death every day. Death no longer frightens you. I live with it every day. I know what it's like. I know the modus operandi of death. A curse that breaks through the shell of one's own virtue. It's what I was telling you earlier. In other words, you're not always in crisis because you did everything wrong. Sometimes you're in crisis because you did everything right. The curse emerges from the shell of one's own virtue. You did everything right and completed that stage. Now it's time for a new one. What did I do to deserve this? You did many good things, that's why this is happening. If I hadn't done them, I would be repeating the same lesson. Living it all over again. Because you did everything so well, it's time to close this experience and move on to another. Notice how interesting this is, when you're in crisis, to think in this way. What if I haven't done everything wrong? What if I'm experiencing a crisis precisely because I did everything right, and now it's time to turn the page? It's an intriguing perspective. He's about to make a point that I find very interesting. Sometimes we think that comedy, which often plays with irony and sarcasm, that myth, which is sometimes very enigmatic and symbolic, or fairy tales, which always end with a little kiss, and they lived happily ever after, are less realistic than tragedy. Because life is heavy metal, right? It has to be intense, you have to cry, you have to fall apart, you have to blind yourself, kill your father. Life is tough, so tragedy seems more realistic. He said, look, this is typical of those who lack experience. And he's right. There has never been a wise person in history who didn't consider comedy to be more initiatory and profound than tragedy. Comedy, myth, and even fairy tales are more initiatory and profound than tragedy. He will explain why. Because tragedy is poor, perplexity in the face of loss. And comedy, myth, and fairy tales are about understanding and reconciliation. It is when you realize that all of it has a greater meaning, that, in fact, you have lost nothing, because nothing ever truly belonged to you. And that, simply, your consciousness was invited to ascend to a higher level. So, tragedy reflects perplexity, while comedy reflects understanding, the assimilation of the moral of the story. Thus, it ceases to be tragic and becomes interesting, it gains meaning. And he will say, tragedy ends in death and fragmentation. In other words, the loss of what we love, it is always fragmentation. They took a piece of me. What happened? The daughter got married. They took a piece of me. What happened? The mother passed away. No. Fairy tales always show in this a possibility of reconciliation, of harmony, of happily ever after. Well, I found more of my mother's essence. I discovered a deeper way to love, because when you love a child and they leave, you realize that you do not own anything. You are a vessel for enriching the gifts of life. Things come into your hands, you give everything you have, and then you let go. You allow them to follow their own path, and everything in life is like this. Therefore, this experience taught me. So, there is no loss, there is reconciliation, there is harmonization. I understand the meaning behind all of this. So, when you see the kiss in Snow White, by the way, between us, everyone, there are moments of revolt, moments of tragedy. There is something that really gets to me, and people come and say that fairy tales, fantasy, shouldn't be told to children, or even worse. Nowadays there's this trend of saying that Snow White is politically incorrect because the prince kissed a sleeping woman, that this is disrespectful to women. Laughter. For a philosopher, this is unbearable. The only reason I don't die from it is because I'm living through a tragedy. What is truly unbearable is, Because this is highly symbolic. Did you notice any similarity between these two scenes? Snow White being kissed by the prince and Adam's finger touching God's finger, it's the same thing. In this duality, the prince represents the spirit, which kisses matter, awakens it from its horizontality, and unites with it. It is the same as God and Adam. It is the moment you discover within yourself. The prince, the finger of God, the divine essence, he lifts you from horizontality, he makes you stand upright, he awakens you. In other words, the fairy tale ultimately shows that the human soul, white and pure as snow, has become more aware of its essence, of its being. That Adam stood up in order to touch the finger of God. In other words, he became upright, he became human. It is the same thing, exactly the same. Soon, people will say that the creation of Adam was politically incorrect, because Adam was sleeping and God went there to disturb him. We live in an age of literalism. This leads to things so ridiculous that it is hard to believe, hard to swallow. And I have seen this every day. I even avoid talking about fairy tales nowadays because it turns into a brawl. It's impossible to take it seriously. This reveals a society that understands nothing about symbolism. If there is no understanding of symbolism, why can I deduce this, as the somewhat tedious philosopher that I am called to be? They have no symbolic vision of life at all. They must be suffering immensely. Because life without symbolism is something that makes no sense at all. Don't you agree? It's senseless. Things are constantly being given to us and then taken away. How tedious. What a sadistic God. He gives us things, and then, just around the next corner, he takes them away. Life without symbolism is a kind of hell. We end up having to escape it with palliatives, with distractions, with addictions, just to keep ourselves occupied and avoid seeing the tragedy we are caught in. And it all comes down to that. That is the picture of life when it is lived on a superficial level. So, if there is no symbolism, things are truly bleak. Notice how interesting this example he gives is. A person with an awakened consciousness who increasingly clings to what is essential and permanent within themselves becomes indifferent to what is fleeting, just as boiling water is indifferent to bubbles, or the cosmos to the disappearance of galaxies. In other words, the changes that occur momentarily in life, you understand that they have come and that they will pass. But you know that they cannot steal from you what you truly are. You know that whether they come or not is not in vain. It is so that you can demonstrate who you are, so that you can give your best. But you also know that their destiny is to come and go, and that they will not take away your essence with them. What you are cannot be taken away. So, he says that a certain indifference, not in a negative sense, but in a positive one, of not allowing oneself to be destroyed by what is transient, is a quality of humanity, of the wise person. He understands that the transient is part of the play of appearances, but that, in truth, he cannot lose anything. The more he evolves, the more fraternal he becomes, and the more the essence of all beings is with him. Therefore, it is not physical death that will take a being away from him. It is not physical death that will distance someone whose essence he has brought close to his heart. Do you remember? I can't resist, please forgive me. But I think there isn't a single lecture where I don't mention Khalil Gibran talking with Mary Haskell, because that is simply irresistible. He talks about almost everything in those blessed letters he writes to the love of his life, who is Mary Haskell. There is a passage that I love, where he turns to her and says, "Look, Mary, I'm a very stubborn man. There are two things that no one will ever convince me of. First, that I do not have an immortal soul. Second, that my soul could ever be separated from yours." And this was such a profound experience for both of them, that Mary was the closest person Gibran ever had. When she attended his funeral, people were shocked because she was smiling. No one knew who she was, because their relationship was very intimate. And people said, "That woman is laughing at the funeral. Who is she?" And no one should have been suffering more than she was, but, nevertheless, she was certain that she could never lose him. That nothing and no one could ever take Gibran away from her. You see, she had reached such a level of unity that appearances, the body of Gibran, her own body, were like bubbles. But she understood what was truly profound. That this could never be broken, that it could never be separated. Each time a person conquers more of their own essence, appearances begin to matter less and less. No one saw Mary, the one who had the greatest reason to weep, shed a single tear at Gibran's death. To grow is to prepare oneself to see what truly is. I find that very beautiful. To grow is to prepare oneself to see the reality of the universe. Reality is, there is something permanent. And when we have our feet grounded in what is permanent, the ground does not shake, we do not become unstable, and we no longer suffer as much. There are no more tragedies for those who stand on solid ground. A place to set our feet. And the solid ground upon which we set our feet is the wisdom of the essence of life, which cannot be lost. He presents these two passages, which I find very beautiful. He brings them, I'm just highlighting them, from Ovid's Metamorphoses, the Roman poet. Everything is in flux, nothing dies. The spirit wanders, now here, now there, and inhabits whichever vessel it pleases. For what once existed is no more, and what did not exist has begun to be, and thus, the entire cycle of movement begins anew. You see, the spirit occupies different vessels, but it does not mourn when a vessel breaks. You know that other vessels will come, but the essence is never lost. In the Bhagavad Gita, it is only the bodies that perish, while the eternal, the imperishable, and the incomprehensible remain. I perish. Only the bodies. The incomprehensible, the self, does not perish. And when one becomes aware of this incomprehensible self, when it becomes comprehensible, there is no longer so much sorrow for the vessels. The flame does not cease to exist when the candles have finished melting. The flame will inhabit another candle, another place. The flame is permanent, it is eternal, and we must be conscious of the flame within us. And this lifts us out of instability. It is said that all of life. Imagine a road with 500 arrows pointing that way, another pointing over there, another to the side, another downwards, 1,000 arrows all pointing in different directions, and we go that way. It is said that every event in your life is an arrow, a sign pointing you to go that way, to find what is permanent. But you don't read this sign. Do you think it's just something nice? You think, oh, it'll go that way, it must be pointing over there. We don't know how to read the signs that life gives us. And so we suffer. We suffer, which means we've taken the wrong path, especially when the suffering is destructive. We've chosen the wrong direction. Learn to read the signs along the road. It helps. And the signs along the road were created to guide you to your destination. And there is a destination for humanity. He will say that the historical hero sometimes faces a challenge where people claim, look, this idea of a hero you're talking about only works for mythical heroes. Imaginary heroes, not historical ones. The historical heroes had to overcome real, external obstacles. Julius Caesar truly had to win the Gallic Wars. Joan of Arc had to fight against the English. These are concrete examples. He says, look, you're only seeing the surface, because when a hero mounts their horse and goes into battle, the most important victory they needed to achieve had already taken place within themselves. Victory is not what happens on the outside, it is what has already happened inside. What happens outside is merely a consequence. Doesn't this strongly remind you of the Dhammapada? Exactly, right? More than the one who defeats 1,000 men in battle is the one who conquers himself. The warrior who enters battle has already overcome himself. The essential part is done, the rest follows. Krishnamurti turns to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita and says, fight, for I have already conquered for you. Internally, he had already fought his battle. He had come to see Krishnamurti, who represented the essence, his sacred self. Now it was just a matter of taking action. It was done, it was accomplished. The material aspect was merely a consequence. He had already understood the myth. He had already embraced the idea, the archetype. Forces are rediscovered and revitalized within oneself to bring about the transfiguration of the world, redeemed through love and knowledge. Imagine what that means. He says that there are many little golden seeds inside you. Everything good you have done up to now is because you activated one of those little golden seeds. But you can't settle for just one, because to become a complete human being, you have 7 seeds that must bloom. It's a very symbolic name. Did one bloom? That's good, it looks nice, it gives flowers. But when those flowers wither, they need another one to be born. You have to go back there, redeem something that was forgotten, and make it bloom. This will lead you to another stage of growth. There comes a certain moment when the capacity of that second little seed is exhausted. You have to go back, and this will generate a crisis. Take the third little seed and make it bloom. Do you notice how this creates a kind of sine wave? You're up there, but you're going to experience a crisis. Why is that? You've only developed up to the fifth little seed. There are still two waiting for their turn. There are elements you need to go back to, bring to the surface, and experience, so that you may become a complete being. Thus, you generate these micro-crises along the way, both individually and collectively. As long as we have not reached the fullness of our being, as long as there are seeds left behind, waiting, there will be crisis. And it may be, as we have already mentioned, that the crisis happened because you finished developing the fourth seed. And now it is time for the fifth. This is actually something to be celebrated, but we tend to lament it because we do not like crises. It is not pleasant, but sometimes it is a sign of growth. Notice that, sometimes, within society, in certain situations, like a young person taking a college entrance exam, he does not think he is taking the exam because he is being punished by life. He is taking the exam because he finished high school and moved forward. Is it difficult? Yes, it is, but it is a sign that he has made it this far. If we understood that human pedagogy is an imitation of the pedagogy of life, we would understand that the tests come at the moment we close. The previous stage, this is natural. He speaks about the life of Buddha in a way I had never seen anyone do before, and I find it very beautiful. He talks about Buddha, recounts the whole story to show that Buddha and other historical heroes perfectly embodied the monomyth. He even convinced me of this. I had never stopped to think about it before. In other words, that process of leaving everyday life in Kapilavastu, facing his trials, suffering, and then reaching enlightenment, and then returning to humanity to share what he had discovered. Then he goes on to compare this with people everywhere, in all kinds of places. The return of Moses with the tablets of the law, who promised to return with fire, Aeneas, who comes back with the household gods and Penates to found the precursor of Rome. In other words, everyone who was a forerunner of something in history did this. He left his daily life, fought with all his might, and we thought he was going to lose, but he won. He was victorious and returns to bring this contribution, which allows all of humanity to leap forward, thanks to his triumph. So, the founding of Rome was a civilizational leap. Each of these heroes enabled a civilizational leap for humanity, because they returned to share the fruits of their victory over themselves. So, he is going to show us, I found this very beautiful. When Buddha attains his enlightenment, he places himself in what he calls the immovable point. Does anyone know the story of Buddha's life? When he reaches enlightenment, he is there, sitting under the tree. In Bodh Gaya, he begins to meditate, and the demon Mara comes, throwing all kinds of temptations at him, but he remains completely unmoved. An army marches against him, and when they shoot arrows, they turn into flower petals falling upon him, and he remains there. He no longer believes in appearances. Then, at a certain moment, the demon Mara questions his right to be there, seated upon the immovable point, the center of the universe. Iona. At that moment, he makes a mudra with his hand and touches the earth. He calls upon the earth as a witness, affirming his right to be there. The earth testifies in his favor. He has the right to be at that point, immovable, at the center. The earth testifies on his behalf, and he defeats the demon Mara. And enlightenment arrives. He returns and spends a long time sharing teachings throughout the world. This idea he presents of the immovable point, my friends, is one of the oldest myths of humanity. It is the symbolism of the center. The center. It is that sacred point around which our entire life should be organized. It is the magic of the circumferences spoken of in Hermeticism. The most perfect shape in the universe is the circumference, because it has a hidden center, which is your essence, your divine self, and all the points of your life should be equidistant from it. So, a being who possesses a spherical consciousness, with all points equally connected to the center, is a wise person. It is no coincidence that Plato said the most evolved form was the spherical form. Everything is equally attended to by the center. You notice that when a city is founded, the first thing done is to place a crucifix there and hold a mass. And the city grows around that sacred center. The sanctification of each step. Intuitively, we know that at the center of the universe, at the center of the human being, there exists a divine essence that gives meaning to everything. We need to find this center. The Hermetic tradition taught that we move in a spiral, passing through points of experience and narrowing in until we reach this center. This is the process of evolution. It is like a Christmas tree. At the very top, the five-pointed star is placed. It represents the victory of the fifth element over the four, which tradition refers to as the quaternary or the personality. It is the triumph of the immortal over the mortal. So this idea is fascinating, to claim the center. Buddha sits at the center. The unmoving point of the universe, his very own center. And he calls upon the earth to bear witness in his favor. In other words, the earth shows that his entire journey was to conquer this center, and now he is worthy. He is the master of himself, and all the elements of his life revolve around him. The other day I was watching, everyone watches, don't say you don't, because I know you secretly do, those thousands of TED conferences. Don't you watch them? I watch one or another from time to time. I was watching a talk by a Brazilian entrepreneur named Ricardo Semler. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but it's quite interesting. He has a whole revolutionary project in education, a school called Lumiere. He says the following: look, instead of having the child study mathematics, I have the child assemble a bicycle. I want to see someone make a bicycle wheel without knowing what pi is. He discovers what pi is because he wants to build a bicycle. I thought that was excellent. The idea, he really does this method within his system, which is quite revolutionary and educational. I started thinking, well, to build a bicycle wheel, he's not only going to discover what pi is in mathematics, but he's also going to discover the value of the center. In philosophy as well, you can draw other conclusions from this. Because he will discover that, without a center, there is no wheel. And that it is from this central axis that everything emanates. So, instead of just making a mathematical reflection, you can also make a philosophical reflection, and by building a bicycle, you are also teaching philosophy. If you just shift your reasoning a little toward the symbolic, you are also teaching philosophy, because it is present in everything. And I don't understand how people can say that philosophy isn't practical. It is in everything. It is in the reason behind all things. If you want to find philosophy, just seek the reason behind any event in your life. You will realize what philosophy is for. Well, moving on. He will say that there is a unity of the human spirit in aspirations, powers, challenges overcome, and wisdom gained. This is the path of the monomyth. Everyone will go through it. It's not a matter of wanting it or not. It is what nature has in store for us as human beings. We have all these possibilities, a shared journey. And the hero goes ahead to show us the way. There is a path outlined, established in the realm of ideas, outlined. That's the word I was looking for, I found it. Outlined in the realm of ideas, there is still the hero who goes ahead to show you the way. And this would be the teaching of the myth. The hero is the son of the king, a divine redemptive image that resides within us, waiting to be recognized and brought to life, to give birth to our human consciousness. It is very common in these myths for the hero to be a prince, to be the son of a king. And we, in fact, are children of our divine essence, which should reign over our lives. And by recognizing this parentage, we discover our ancestry, we find our name, our inner name, the family to which we belong. To find this essence that brought us into the world. We came into the world as children of our essence, so that we could reflect it in the tangible world. So we are children of kings, the divine self within us, all of us. And by recognizing this parentage, you know those things that even soap operas sometimes portray? There is always a character who doesn't know who their father is and discovers it along the way. This is an inheritance from a mythical fragment. The reunion with the father is the reunion with the essence that brought you into the world. With the axis of your wheel, your center. This is the symbolism of the center that lives within every human being. How beautiful this is, what he presents in the book. Gospel, Apocryphal of Eve. I am you and you are me. And wherever you may be, there I will be. I'm everywhere, and whenever you wish, you will find me, and in finding me, you will find yourselves. This is God speaking to the human being. Do you understand this? Whenever you wish, you can find me anywhere, because it is to see God in all things. And if you find the divine, you find yourself. Because you have found that which originally gave rise to your idea in the world, your essence, your true identity. Well, if we consider that the center exists in all things, the idea that in everything there is something divine, an essence, the center is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The center, as he calls it, is the immovable point, ubiquitous, omnipresent. In other words, everything has its center. There is something divine in all things, through which the energies of eternity break into the temporal. In other words, the essence, the center, casts a shadow in the manifested world, which is the body. And the body evolves in order to recognize its father, its essence, from where it came and to where it will return. Remember the dynamic eternity of Helena Blavatsky. It may be that there is life in the universe, in all directions. I do not know what language it speaks. I do not know what form it has, but I know what it is saying. All lives in the universe are calling beings back to the Father's house. This is the message that echoes in all four corners of the universe. Find yourself, find the king, return to unity. And that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? I believe that, in fact, all the languages of the universe must be saying this very same thing. He will say that the sacred places that exist everywhere, where temples were built, you notice there are some things in history that are quite curious. Troy, for example, how many Troys have already been discovered, one on top of the other? People, the citizen destroyed Troy because they didn't build it. Why didn't they build Troy elsewhere? Don't you find it strange? It had to be there, another Troy. They set it on fire, destroyed it, then came Helen I, Helen II, Helen III, they wrecked everything. There must have been many Helens and similar stories throughout history. It kept being destroyed in the same place. Why? Because that was a sacred place. It couldn't be just anywhere. It's as if it were an acupuncture point on the body of the earth. It couldn't be just anywhere. These places become sacred because someone Socratic these locations, breaking through the barrier of time and encountering eternity. Sacred places are those where a human being has broken the barrier of time and found eternity. It's as if they opened a channel of communication between the energies of the heavens and the earth. And if you want to find those energies, it's there. It's a good place for you to align yourself with them, because there have already been precedents. There have already been precedents. Today, as I was walking down the street, I found it amusing. You see this all the time. We have this almost intuitively, which are distortions of these original ideas. I passed by a store with a sports lottery, and there was a sign saying, "Someone won the Mega Sena here in 2015. Everyone was lining up. People felt they had to play there. Because someone had already won there, so that spot was considered special. Do you notice how we have irrational habits? But who knows, maybe behind this there is a myth. These points of sacredness are places where eternity has already communicated with time. Someone reached eternity there. Therefore, that place becomes an energetic center. A citizen cannot build the city anywhere else. It has to be there, even if it means building one on top of the other. Well, that's it. We'll stop here for today. In fact, we've gone well over our time. I remind you that we are covering one chapter per week. So, next week, chapter 1 of the first part. All right? Thank you, everyone.